One of the perhaps more eye-opening ideas that you've put into practice for the last few years has been that employees get to, in a sense, see each other's salaries and set each other's salaries. How does that process work? And how does that process work?
So it's slightly changed in recent years because we've learned a lot by implementing some of these methods. So it's actually difficult for some people to assign a number to themselves. So I'll talk about what we do now versus what we've historically done. What we've historically done actually is we asked people to make recommendations for their salary, public recommendations. All of the data that we have across Satalia is typically transparent. And then people then vote on whether those salaries should be increased or decreased or kept the same. And the weighting that you have in that decision is determined by how closely you've worked with that individual, how knowledgeable you are about that particular domain, maybe even how knowledgeable you are about the strategy of the organization. So the closer you are, the more weighting you have around that decision. Since then, we've learned that it's been difficult for people to make recommendations for their salaries. And now we ask people to do peer-to-peer voting on people's skills. And what we can do is we can map those skills to then market rates, which is much easier. But one interesting outcome from our initial investigation was that females tended to undervalue themselves. We had a number of females that were making recommendations for their salaries that were clearly undervaluing. And what was really interesting is the peers said, what are you talking about? You need to increase your salary. So what it did is it identified a bias that they had, and the crowd then solved that.
You've shown me some of the dashboards that you have in the organization that illustrate this. There are graphs and charts that show who's getting more recommendations and who's getting less recommendations. Just give us a flavor for how that works in the salary domain and the skills domain, and what would people see?
So my hypothesis is that if you give people information, they make good decisions. And that's the critical goal. And that's what we're trying to utilize machine learning to do, is identify who needs to know what and then get that information to them. But we will pull in data across Slack, across our Gmail. We'll do surveys as well to understand people's understanding of our strategy. And then we will visualize that in a way that helps them use those insights to then make decisions, whether it's decisions about feedback or decisions about salary or decisions about who to hire or not. So we've created this knowledge graph capturing all of this data. And from that knowledge graph, we surface these insights to allow humans to then make decisions.
But when you say you surface these insights are essentially available on an internal website for anyone to click at, look at, and review.
That's right. And there's lots of interesting challenges with this. As I say, we default to transparency. But if you dig into some of our data, I'm sure you can identify secret lovers in the company. You could maybe make predictions about who's going to leave the company before they know they're going to leave the company. So it does raise a lot of interesting ethical questions around what data should be available to people, and what decisions and controls should you have over these insights.
Absolutely. And we should talk about the ethics in a moment or two. So as we step through, you've got a company where people essentially assign themselves to their own projects. There are no managers. There is a mechanism for peer-based evaluation that leads to people selecting people's salaries changing and the projects they work on changing. I also understand that there are no real holiday limits in Satalia either. So people can just take holiday as and when they want.
That's right.
Is that right?
We default to having no rules. Now, as we're getting bigger, we're having to put those structures in place. But philosophically, when we build processes and structures, we try not to limit people's freedom. And so the expenses and holidays are a great example. You could give people a limit on how many days they can take, or you could give people a limit on how much they can spend. But what we want to do is we want to give people total freedom. So you can take as many days as you want, you can spend whatever you want. But counter to that, what we need to do is we need to surface that information so that they can make better decisions and other people can make better decisions. We're now actually creating dashboards to help people understand who are taking too much holiday, who are not taking enough holiday, and then using that to then help them make better decisions.
Do you think there's a particular type of person for whom this kind of setup will work, a sort of personality or skill base or just general profile, for whom this sort of radical decentralization bottom up is more well suited, and there are characters for whom it just won't settle?
I used to think the answer was yes, that this would only work for a certain type of person. But over the years, I've realized that everybody that's come into Satalia has really embraced these ways of working. Some have struggled, but I think the beauty of the platform is whilst we use these technologies to operate in a swarm-like way, you can actually use it to operate in a very hierarchical way as well. So instead of dictating how you're meant to operate, we actually have a platform that allows different organizational ideologies, methodologies to emerge. So it might be, for example, we need to really take one of our products to market, in which case being very kind of hierarchical and rigid might be the right approach. So people are actually finding themselves and operating in ways that sit well with them.
So there's an adaptability, right? There's a moment where you need to be bottom up and self-organized, and you can do that. But there's a moment where maybe there's an emergency and you just need to say to someone, you're going to be the gubernator, or you're going to steer this thing through to completion because we have to just get there.
Absolutely. And I'd like to think that in the 10 years that Satalia has been around, we've never had to tell anybody what to do. Even with feedback, even with salary setting, it was their choice. If they didn't want to do it, we could try and find another mechanism to solve that problem.
Do employees feel surveilled, and who makes sure that they aren't actually simply behaving like little cells in a spreadsheet being buffeted around by this layer of machine learning and optimization that you've put in?
It's a great question. And because we don't have a leadership team that's kind of secretly looking at this stuff and that all data's open, then they embrace these ideas much more because they feel like they have power to control the shape of the company. They're not being dictated to. It is actually difficult to ask people to report on what they do, which is where we get all of our data. But the alternative is that they have a manager that's looking over their shoulders, that's asking them, what did you do yesterday? And I guess the organization understand by providing that data themselves, we can then be much more effective at making decisions, and they can have bigger salaries because we don't have to hire managers. So they do see the benefit. And it was difficult actually early on because people didn't see that benefit, but we keep communicating and giving case studies and examples about why now this data is crucial in enabling us to scale and become a bigger, more impactful organization.
Have you taken specific steps to think through the data governance issues and the ethics and what the implications are of having all this data about your employees' behavior?
Absolutely. We have thought really carefully about these concepts, and we have our own governance framework, which consists of 4 parts. The first one is around responsibility. Who is responsible for building machine learning models that are biased and things like that. The second is around auditability. So can we trace and track what decisions are being made and how they're being made? The third element is around explainability, which is critical nowadays. Can we explain how these AIs are making their decisions? And the fourth one is around accessibility. So can we make sure that data and information is transparent and accessible by everybody? And so all of the processes and structures that we put in place, we make sure that we look at from this governance perspective. On top of that, we have incredibly strong culture and set of principles. So all of the structures and processes that we put in place, we try to align with four key principles. The first is equality, freedom, safety, and justice. So any processes that we put in place that violates that, then we don't implement.